ora tātou. Welcome to this discussion. I'm Linda Clark. I'm one of the partners at Dentons Kensington Swan, and I've been joined by three terrific panellists. I'll introduce them in a moment. The idea for this discussion came about when I was working alongside two of our guests earlier this year, conducting an investigation into aspects of ACC's management of personal information. Now, we won't dwell on that investigation. If you're interested, the report that resulted as at the end of the investigation has been published and is available on ACC's website. But in the course of that investigation, one of the themes that bubbled up was that privacy is more complex than most people think, and that it's absolutely possible, if you put it another way, that people or businesses think they're doing well with privacy when actually they're not. And out of that theme and talking about it with, as I say, two of our guests this morning, we just thought there were some lessons about that and some observations about that others would find interesting and hopefully helpful. And that's why we invited you to join us for this webinar. So my guests are Liz McPherson. Liz is the Deputy Privacy Commissioner. Previously, she was the government statistician. Another of my guests is Vanessa Oakley. Vanessa is the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer at FNZ Group, but prior to that, she was or has had senior roles both at ACC, which is where I worked with her most closely recently, and before that at Chorus. And last but not least is my fellow partner, Campbell Featherstone. Campbell is another of our Wellington-based partners here at Dentons Kensington Swan, and he's a commercial lawyer, but he has a particular specialty in privacy and technology. So, an opening assessment from all of you, and maybe I'll start with you, Vanessa. The subject, we've kind of framed this discussion under the heading of how hard or staying on the right side of the Privacy Act. So the question is, how hard is that? How hard is it to stay on the right side of the Act in your view?
Thanks, Linda. Good morning, everyone. In theory, it's not. So in theory, if you commit to something, you stay active on it, you can achieve it. It doesn't mean that there aren't bumps along the road. We all get those, particularly in today's fast world. But in practice, privacy touches everybody, which is our focus today, and getting everybody lined up. The analogy I'd use is a community. It takes a community to raise a child. It takes an enterprise to care about privacy and execute well on privacy. So in practice, it can be a lot harder.
Campbell, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of compliance with privacy law is actually common sense. But it's all about having the right culture in an organisation to make sure that everyone is aware of what they need to do and is deploying it almost by design in every aspect of how they go about business. I think what can be quite hard is changing how you've done things over the past 20, 30 years because you thought that was the right way to do it. It's a dynamic situation, privacy compliance. You need to be on top of things. You need to make sure that as technologies change, as how you do business changes, that you're remaining on top of those privacy issues.
Liz, back to you. I mean, my initial observation was that this general observation that people think it's easy to think you're doing this well when actually you're not. How often do you see that? Oh, sorry, you're just on mute. I'll just get you to unmute yourself. One of us had to do it.
Yeah,
go.
And it was me. There you go.
Yeah.
So very often, situations where people, agencies have had good policies and processes in place and have basically drifted into that sort of set and forget mode. So, and haven't thought through the various different aspects of the way in which personal information flows through the organisation, even understand the nature of the information they are holding. But as Vanessa and Campbell both said, it takes a whole organisation to really look after and value personal information. And from that perspective, it's not sufficient to simply have a privacy officer who does that. The whole organisation needs to get it.
And how often is it that you see in organisations where the weight of the responsibility for all of this sits with, you know, the privacy team and the privacy officer, however well resourced that part of the business is?
Very frequently, more frequently than I'd like to see, and very often the privacy team is very small within the organisation. Unlike, you'll find me making these connections time and time again. Unlike health and safety, for example, where health and safety responsibilities are carried throughout the organisation right up to the senior leadership. We very often see that the privacy component sits with maybe with the part of the legal team, in-house legal team, but isn't really threaded through the DNA of the organisation in the same way as agencies have attempted to do with health and safety.
We'll come back to that point, because I think you know, changes to the Act, more recent changes to the Act have probably given, well, certainly given your office more levers to pull and make the parallel with health and safety, I think, a little bit more obvious for everybody. But I'll come back to that later. Vanessa, one of the, and not talking about ACC, but in a general sense, I mean, one of my other observations, I think, having gone through the exercise of doing that investigation most recently, but from other clients too, is the sense that there can be some very fundamental misunderstandings within an organisation about what privacy actually means and what the obligations under the Act actually mean. Do you agree with that as an observation?
Yeah, I think I do, Linda, and I should probably be really clear that I'm not representing any employers today. I'm just Vanessa for the next 2 days anyway. But anyone who knows, you'll get pretty consistent Vanessa regardless of what I'm doing. But yes, I do. And look, sometimes I think Campbell's comment is a really good one, common sense. It's easy for us to say that, but I'm sort of hoping we'll talk about that a bit more later. But with my legal hat on, you know, I've always sort of used the language of need to know information. Do you need to know that information to do what you're doing at work? And for 2 reasons. One, it protects the individual's information. But secondly, it also protects your people, that they're just getting the information that they need to do their job. And so I guess I've sort of grown up with that mantra in jobs in the private sector and also the public sector. And I start my common sense from there.
Yeah, Campbell, what's your, I mean, that's quite an interesting, I mean, that's a sort of easy how-to message that you can embed in an organisation and sort of need to know. But it does seem that can easily bleed, can't it? Because if there's a misunderstanding that even talking about personal information in-house can be a breach of somebody's privacy, if that's not really understood by those in the organisation, then the needs to know can sometimes be broader than it needs to be. Campbell, you comment on that first, perhaps.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are sort of mystified by what privacy actually is, and you know, dealing with things like the GDPR, which is grossly complicated and scary, doesn't help with that. A lot of people, I think, still equate privacy with IT security, and that's quite a daunting topic. But that's not what privacy is all about. In fact, a lot of the worst privacy breaches happen due to human error. So that just emphasises, I think, the need to have a really strong privacy culture and sort of understand, I guess, the trust that's been placed in you as an organisation when you look after someone's personal information, what it means to that person, what it means to your relationship with that person as a customer, most likely, what it means for your reputation as an organisation as well.
So a number of you have talked about this concept of the privacy culture. So Liz, to you on this point first, what are the key elements, do you think, of a mature privacy culture in any organisation?
Well, any organisation, it starts by valuing the personal information that you hold. It starts by you understanding the nature of that personal information, but first and foremost, that is information about individuals. It goes to the core of who they are, and you know, the privacy culture starts by that, truly valuing it and thinking about that individual, thinking about the fact that you hold that information in trust. And if every part of the organisation takes that seriously, I often say to people who have just had a big data breach, for example, if you focus on the individual first, and think about their needs and the harm that's been caused to them, most other things will flow from there. So that's your starting point, and that needs to be, everyone in the organisation needs to get that, and they need to understand that personal information isn't, it's the information that might be their customers' data, but it's also the personal information that the organisation holds on yourself. It's the HR data too. So that's the basic starting point for a privacy culture.
Can I just stop you there? I mean, wouldn't most organisations, wouldn't most chief executives, most board chairs say they do that?
Okay, so, well,
because what's the difference between, you know, if I'm the chair of a business, I'm going to say that because I'm even going to believe it. But what's the difference between saying it, believing it, and actually doing it?
Oh, well, it's being able to demonstrate that you've actually got the systems and processes in place that mean that that information is being looked after, and that individuals know that if, for example, they do access information that they are not supposed to be seen, that the organisation will know about it, and that those individuals actually do, their reaction to, for example, their reaction to being able to access a system that they shouldn't be able to access is not, oh gosh, let's have a look around. It's, I shouldn't be able to see this. I'm going to tell somebody I shouldn't be able to see this, and the organisation then putting it right. So, I mean, my question always to boards in terms of really valuing the personal information would be, how often do they actually see information reported to the board on the nature of the personal information that flows through the organisation, the complaints that are coming in, the breach reporting, how do they ensure that the organisation's risks are assessed and appropriate mitigation measures are put in place in terms of really treasuring that information?
Vanessa, what's your view on that? What do you think are the elements, the key elements of a mature privacy culture?
Look, I think the outcome is trust. And probably the other word that comes to mind is ethics and doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, common sense words like need to know and culture. The trick, of course, is what does doing the right thing look like? And how do you know it's just the way we do things around here? They're a test for me. I think, you know, good boards are onto this, and there's plenty of good directors out there that I've seen that are onto this and inquiring about this. But those are hard questions to answer. You know, what do the people in the organisation say are the way we do things around here? I think segues, you know, into that lovely word that I agree with from Campbell of culture.
Yeah, but it's easy in an organisation, and certainly we see this in our work, where you have what I call the culture of sort of false bottoms. So you can be assured about certain practices or elements of culture, but then when you probe or push a little bit further, you discover that actually the bottom just sort of falls a bit lower than the standards that were set out initially. And if you probe a bit further, the standards, you realize that the reality is below that again. And maybe this is an element that happens in all businesses, but I think in New Zealand businesses in particular, because often we're uncomfortable with difficult conversations, false bottoms in an organisation are relatively common, and in this area too. Campbell, interested in your observations about the elements of a mature privacy culture.
Yeah, so we touched on privacy by design and sort of building privacy into processes, systems from the ground up. I think one of the acid tests for an organisation's privacy culture is what they do when something goes wrong, because it's inevitable. I think you've either been hacked or you're about to be hacked. You need to have a plan in place, and you need to respond appropriately when things do go wrong. And I think having a robust plan in place, acknowledging what has gone wrong and responding to it appropriately, that's evidence of a mature privacy culture, and it helps you work on rebuilding trust with your with consumers. It helps on reputation management. Yeah, I mean it's a key part of any, I think, mature privacy culture is to prepare for the worst case scenario, and acknowledge that no matter how hard you try, there will be things that slip through the cracks, and you need to be able to respond to them promptly.
And that's really putting it fair and square into your sort of regular risk assessment kind of table, isn't it? And seeing it as a I mean, I think all of you have mentioned, I mean, Liz, you mentioned too, that there will be breaches from time to time. There will be mistakes, human error. It's just understanding where that sits and what your mitigation steps are. In that sense, let's come back to your parallel with health and safety, Liz, that you mentioned a little bit earlier, because certainly if you think about what steps businesses have put in place as a result of their particularly board understanding, but also senior leadership and legal in-house legal understanding about the risk associated with health and safety breaches now. Do you see, I mean, what's your observation on how that works if we look at how businesses respond to health and safety and how businesses respond to the risk of privacy breaches or just maintaining compliance with the Act?
Well, just building off Campbell's point before, I think in terms of that link between health and safety and privacy, I was one person who lived through the aftermath of Pike River. I happened to be in the Department of Labour part of MB when that was all trucking through. And one of the things that we really learned as a result of Pike River was the importance, absolute importance of your near miss reporting, of really understanding what's going on behind the scenes. So we talked earlier about the fact that the new Privacy Act requires agencies to do some new things, one of which is mandatory data breach reporting. Almost inevitably, where we see one of these incidents that Campbell's just been talking about, when we look in behind the scenes, what we find is that there's been a near miss. The same sort of thing almost happened 5-6 times beforehand, and the organisation went, phew, great, didn't happen, didn't have to tell the Privacy Commissioner about that one. Instead of actually saying, this is a critical part of our privacy management system, this is a critical part of our culture, we need to understand why this happened so that we can prevent the bigger incident happening in the future. And I think that's part of the connection between, if you think about health and safety and privacy, think about those things that will actually keep you and your people safe, and the information that you hold safe. Where are your vulnerabilities? Where are your risks? Manage for those. Map them. Understand your information flows. As I said, understand your vulnerabilities, and I agree entirely with Campbell. Plan for the worst. Have a really good incident response plan, and then when you do have an incident, as I said earlier, one of the things I find is a great indicator of a good privacy management culture, a really strong one, is the initial reaction from the agency. It's not how do we protect our reputation, it's how do we protect the individuals who could actually be affected by this breach. How do we close things down as fast as possible? And then how do we protect those individuals? How do we communicate in a way that actually means that they can keep themselves safe? So I think it's, when we think about the interaction between the two systems, it really does come back to making sure that you've got good systems and practices in place there, but never forgetting that ultimately culture eats compliance for breakfast. And that it is your people really valuing the information that they hold and wanting to do the right thing, as Vanessa said, that will make the real difference.
So Vanessa, let's talk about the practicalities of that, if you like, because if you think about a regime in the way that Liz has just described, where you're taking notice of near misses and you're having the conducting sort of debriefs on those so that you use those as learning exercises, and you've got your risk mitigation plan in place, and therefore presumably you're trialing that or having kind of false runs at that from time to time to ensure that it's fit for purpose. Most privacy teams, as Liz mentioned right at the outset, in New Zealand businesses are very small. I dealt with a client this week whose private is a big New Zealand business. It's got a 2-person privacy team. They're very small. That's going to be hard to do with that level of commitment and resourcing, don't you think? I mean, is there an ideal size for this?
I don't think there is an ideal size for this, and I guess I'm going to keep coming back sort of as an enterprise leader to leadership. And you can obviously structure your business and your teams, in different ways. And, that's part of the job here, is what are the roles and responsibilities of who, to make this whole thing hang together. If we start from the top, I am a believer in the tone comes from the top and sets the environment where the people feel safe to speak up so that you can actually get those learning loops going. Linda, I think you were talking before about, a board might dig into things and find a false bottom, I think was the language you used. Well, in my view, that's progress, because you can build from there. So that's sort of step one. I think probably 4 things, so that I don't speak ad nauseum on leadership. Purpose is important. Why are we here? But I do want to emphasise the values-based approach, which, guides how we behave. I think that's really important for privacy. The second thing that I would really encourage is putting a human into every conversation. We get lost in language, compliance words, legislative words, but actually let's put a human being into the conversation, and I have practically found that changes the conversation. The third thing is authenticity, which is what you were really getting at, Linda, which is what you're saying, be it media, internal or otherwise, the reality of what's going on. And the fourth thing is just that team effort. So depending on what you're asking your privacy team to do, I think determines the capability and the size of that team. And just the last thing I'd add, just to sort of join up with Liz and Campbell, is you've got 2 sides of the coin. One is getting an upfront, privacy by design, and the other is being ready to manage, the inherent mistakes that unfortunately, that's just the world that we live in. So I think you've got to focus on both.
Linda, just picking up on that, we know from the research that we do on our data breaches that the leading cause of data breaches is still what is described as human error. We're seeing the malicious activity, sort of hacks and things like that starting to creep up, but still the primary cause of data breaches is what's described as human error. But when you actually look in behind what is human error, often it is things that you could actually scaffold. You could actually keep your people safe by having a look at your systems and processes. There will always be human error, but from our office's perspective, we will be looking hard at places where there are repeats of people sending spreadsheets out of organisations and other things like that, because there are ways and ways of looking after your people and changing your systems to make sure that doesn't happen.
I mentioned at the sort of earlier in this conversation that there's a relatively new act, updated, amended, so the 2020 version, and that provides more levers for your office, Liz, and you've mentioned some of them with the requirement to for businesses and agencies to notify your office of breaches. But I mean, and there's also the opportunity now for the office to issue compliance notices, and you've done that. The first one went to the Reserve Bank. How will that change, do you think, how the office works?
Well, effectively circling back to the conversation we've already had, the way that the office is intending to use those tools is to basically reinforce that privacy needs to be a core focus of the organisation. So you will see us taking more and more of an assurance approach. So what we want is for the boards that Vanessa and Campbell have been talking about, the agency leads, to be thinking about how they put in place their privacy management systems. They're planning for privacy, putting in place their privacy culture. And then we'll be using those tools to allow us to really understand whether that's working or not. The mandatory data breach reporting gives us a bit of an insight into what's going on inside an organisation. If we see a lot of those things happening, it can be both a good story and a bad story, as Vanessa said. Sometimes it's actually that the organisation has really stepped up its game, and so it's actually uncovering more things, and that's a good story. In other cases, we're seeing increase the same breaches over and over again, and it's because the agency isn't taking sufficient care. So we'll use those. We can use our compliance notices to ask people to start or stop doing things, and that again will provide additional motivation. Another thing that you can expect us to do is use our investigations powers as more of an assurance, taking a bit of an assurance investigation, look at how people are doing things. But all of this is because we actually want people to develop a mature privacy management system, and to be taking responsibility for that themselves. As the regulator, we can't audit people into compliance. We want people to want to do the right thing. And so the other thing we'll be doing is really celebrating it when we see it.
And Campbell, I mean, I know a lot of the people listening in or watching into this webinar are in-house counsel. So what is your advice to in-house counsel about what the changes to the statutory framework really mean?
I mean, as we touched on earlier, I think a lot of compliance with privacy law is common sense. And a lot of what you have to do at a practical level to comply with privacy law under the 2020 Act isn't actually that much different from the 1993 Act. But it's a good opportunity for you to really take a closer look at your privacy practices, what you have been doing, where there's room for improvement, knowing that there is more scope for the Privacy Commissioner to take action, if you do get it wrong. But I guess you also put that against the background of, since the 93 Act came in, the world has changed a lot. People are much more aware about the nature of personal information that organisations hold about them, what the risks are. Everything's online these days, everything's vulnerable. And along with the compliance side of things, there's the sort of more practical risk of what happens when it goes wrong. A key example I like to point to just sort of highlight, I guess, why privacy compliance is so important is there's a case in the UK of an ISP TalkTalk who suffered a privacy breach, and they were hit with a fairly substantial fine at the time. So under the then current UK regulations, there was a £400,000 fine, and you might think that that's quite significant. But putting it all in context, they also lost 100,000 customers they also incurred a £60 million cost internally to remedy what they'd got wrong.
Mm.
So I think looking at the two sides of the coin, the compliance side and then the sort of more, I guess, practical considerations, it's a pretty powerful reminder for all organisations as to what they need to do to step up their game.
Mm.
Yeah, and for a lot of businesses, given the role that data and information plays now in just the world of business and how we all interact with each other, a data breach or a privacy breach it can have an enormous impact on reputation and, as you said, Vanessa, this trust.
Mm.
Do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I fully agree with that, Linda. Reputation is everything. Social license, whatever language you want to put around it. I think my observations would be, we're in the private sector. Again, I guess I'm human-centered, customer-focused. If you're not doing a good job there, your customers are going to leave. If you're a business, it gets more interesting if your customers or your stakeholders don't have a choice, and that's something to think about as well in terms of making sure you keep your organisation motivated to be doing the right thing.
Absolutely. One of the things that we do a survey every couple of years, just looking at perceptions of privacy across New Zealand, and what came out clearly there was that 2 out of 3 people said that if they were concerned about the what companies were doing with their data or agencies were doing with their data or security concerns, that they would go elsewhere. So as Vanessa says, if you're in the private sector, that's a big wake-up call. If you're in the public sector, you need to think seriously about the responsibility that you've got, because many of your clients can't go elsewhere. So trust is huge here. If you think about, for most agencies, whether they're public or private, most want to be able to use personal information to be able to innovate, to be able to meet their customers' needs in a whole variety of different ways. If you think about where digital health is going, for example, the ability to be able to provide new services to people in a digital way, that's only possible if you've actually got trust and confidence of the people who are using your services. So as everyone's been saying, well, we've got fines. Actually, in the scheme of things, those fines are not huge. The reputational effect is huge. The need to put things right can actually cost you a huge amount of money as well in terms of your systems and processes. But as Campbell says, the other thing that we've found, and research overseas has found, is that if you do have a big breach, if you put the person at the heart of that breach and you really do your very best to look after them, in some cases you can actually earn trust. Obviously not if you have continuous data breaches, but if you have one of those, and if you really do put the human at the centre, as Vanessa says, you can actually bolster your reputation and your trust.
So if that's your goal, as a, if you're a board member, and that's got to be your goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what are the questions that you need to be asking your SLT to make sure that you've got the right information, so that you can have confidence that your culture your mature culture either is in place or you're making progress towards having that mature culture? Vanessa, what do you think?
Well, probably in the interest of time, I probably use the health and safety analogy here again, because my observation anyway at an executive and a board level is, there has been a pivot over time in terms of the questions that are being asked to sort of dig into the culture versus just the compliance, obviously guided by good information, and keeping an active eye on whether it's the right information, and being able to have those conversations over the top of it. So I am a big advocate for the quality of the conversation over top of the information that's coming up. And that's where you glean, information. Being able to see people from the organisation is something that we see in health and safety. And you know pretty quickly, I mean, I've been at the exec table, so I can kind of get to the top and the bottom of the organisation quite quickly, but you know pretty quickly if people know that they're empowered to stop something if they're worried that there's a health and safety risk. So that's the sort of thing that I would be looking for.
Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, avoiding the the focus on compliance, I think, is really key. I mean, not necessarily large organisations, but we do get clients coming to us with that compliance mindset, and you kind of have to set them on a bit of a path to before we even think about drafting a privacy policy for them, or coming up with a retention policy, just say, well, do you actually understand what personal information you're collecting and in what context, and why, and where does it go? So you need to do a bit of a deep dive if you haven't already, maybe a bit of a sort of self-audit as to, you know, what are we doing with personal information? Why are we doing this with personal information? What measures, controls do we have in place? And where are the gaps? Before you just sort of start ticking boxes around, you know, privacy statements and looking at the law, that you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to actually achieve anything meaningful if you just focus on that compliance front.
It's all music to my ears, Linda.
Well, we like that.
Yeah.
I guess one thing, as a sort of final observations from all of you, is this, I mean, because a number, you're very much singing from the same song sheet in terms of what's required and what good looks like. And there's an acceptance, I think, amongst all of us that, you know, the world's changed a lot, and Campbell made that point from 1993 when the first Act came in to where we are now, and the individual's understanding of the significance of privacy to them will only get greater and greater. So is your expectation that our privacy ecosystem will generally mature? So in the sense that where we have businesses or agencies that don't have a mature culture, privacy culture, that they'll end up being kind of outliers, or are you not that optimistic? What do you think, Liz?
Well, I am optimistic that over time we will actually see an increase in privacy culture, and part of the reason for that is because I think that, well, we, for one thing, will be putting in some emphasis in there, but I think individuals are going to drive it. I think that we're going to see more and more individuals actually you know, voting with their keyboards or fingers or what have you, and moving away from agencies that aren't actually treating their information well. I think we've already seen some of even the big platforms who, let's face it, have a huge amount of power, starting to shift as they've seen their consumer base basically asking the hard question. But there will always be, from the regulator's perspective, because there are always going to be some areas of imbalance of power, there is going to be a critical role for us to play in there. And we will continue to ask the question. But I'm cautiously optimistic, put it that way. Do we have good privacy management cultures right now across the board? I would argue there are some, but not many. I'd like to see that improve. But am I optimistic that we can get there? Yes, but with the right settings in place.
Vanessa, do you share that optimism?
Ooh, I think because I've got this tagged into leadership, I would say that I have waves of optimism generally, and then the odd down day. It's a little bit like driving diversity and inclusion, you know. So, you know, the jury's out for me. The opportunity's there. It's there for the taking. I'd like to see more people taking it, but let's see.
Campbell?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's optimism or not, but I think that we will see a change for the good. It might take a high-profile casualty. So, you know, if the market sees someone suffer a massive privacy breach, not deal with it well, lose 100,000 customers like TalkTalk did, and fold as a result, then that will be a real warning to the rest of the market that they need to take privacy seriously. I hope it's not one of our clients, but yeah, I think it's probably bound to happen at some stage.
Linda, can perhaps qualify my optimism? I mean, I think that, is there non-compliance out there today, and immature privacy cultures? Absolutely. I do think that empowered consumers, I think, will help us. But one of the things that I will be looking at within the privacy sort of ecosystem is how we can strengthen the certainty that provide some more certainty to agencies around what doing the right thing might look like, and then how we can actually follow that up with compliance activity. But at the moment, I do think that there are a lot of agencies who aren't putting the work in because it, they have a they aren't taking seriously enough the the about for the grace of God go I type lessons, and I do think that Campbell may well be right that a big failure might be necessary for some of them. I hope not.
There's sort of two elements in what you've just raised, and I think they're both equally interesting. One is that I mean, for the agencies that are really good at this stuff, we'll never know. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, you might know if you work there. You might feel good about it as a customer, although actually if your privacy is being respected by a business that you're working with or that serves you in some way, there's no action required, really. It's kind of it's almost an invisible good, isn't it? You don't necessarily feel, it's not something you're conscious of necessarily. You're more conscious when the reverse happens and somebody or a business that you're working with doesn't respect your personal information. So in that sense, that the kind of champions of this probably go unrecognized.
I think, well, yes. One of the things, the roles that we have as a regulator is actually to celebrate the champions. So we can do more of that. But also, you can expect to see us doing a bit more. As I said, one of the things about the new Act is that that Campbell didn't pick up on was that one of the key changes is the 1993 Act was largely a reactive act. We had to basically focus on complaints. It was largely individual complaint driven. There was some other capacity, but largely individual complaint driven. The new Act gives us some proactive powers to actually just go out there and look. And that's what we intend to do. So we will be, the sorts of places that we'll be looking, agencies and sectors who hold very large quantities of personal information, and where there's an intersection between that and imbalance of power and vulnerable consumers. So expect to see us looking, and when we do find practice that doesn't look good from a privacy perspective, we obviously will want those agencies to lift their game. But if that doesn't happen, then we have a number of tools available to us, not just compliance notices. One of the things that's still there from the 1993 Act is the ability to name, and reputation effects are important. So from that perspective, we both want to celebrate the successes out there, but we will also be looking hard at those areas where people should be taking care and aren't.
And ultimately, to pick up the second of the points that you raised a moment ago, if there is a complacency, if, as you say, and I don't think any of us would argue against this, there is a complacency in corners of New Zealand business that about privacy, people just thinking there, but for the grace of God, I'll deal with it if I have to. That more active role by the regulator is likely to send the message, isn't it? It's likely to get people's attention.
Well, I hope so. But the other thing is that we will be relying even more heavily on the rest of the privacy ecosystem. You referred to that before. So I'm talking to some of them now, listening in to this webinar, but also the privacy professionals who sit out there in the market. You're part of what can help actually build the privacy capability across New Zealand to actually get this right. So that's going to be a critical part of the way we work too in partnership.
Well, having set that challenge out into the ecosystem, that's probably a really good place to end. I really thank you for your time, Liz, Vanessa, and my fellow partner, Campbell. Thank you very much for a really interesting conversation. And for all of those that you are listening, who were listening or watching in, thank you for your time as well. Go and have a fantastic afternoon. Kia ora, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.